President, we have good news for America's national security. Senators have reached an agreement that clears the way to approve FISA reauthorization tonight. For the information of my colleagues, we will have up to 7 roll call votes. First, we will vote 6 amendments, and then final passage. All day long, we persisted and persisted and persisted in hopes of reaching a breakthrough, and I'm glad we got it done. There was a great deal of doubt that we could get this done, but now we are on a glide path to passing this bill. Allowing FISA to expire would have been dangerous. It's an important part of our national security toolkit and helps law enforcement stop terrorist attacks, drug trafficking, and violent extremism. This legislation has been carefully tailored, and I'm ready to work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to keep strengthening protections for American citizens. I thank all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their good work, and yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator for Kentucky.
The title of this amendment is "The Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale." The Fourth Amendment is no mere limitation of government power. The Fourth Amendment is fundamental to the concept of American liberty. The Fourth Amendment was a response to the British writs of assistance, which served as general warrants, permitted almost limitless searches of homes and ships of colonies. In 1761, an attorney named James Otis forcefully attacked the writs of assistance, and John Adams described that he was so inspired by Otis and the arguments that then and there the child of independence was born. The Fourth Amendment prohibits these kinds of general warrants. For a search to be reasonable, the Fourth Amendment dictates that the government must identify the individual, the items, and the location to be searched. But today, all it takes to eviscerate the Fourth Amendment is some cash. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act already requires the government to seek a court order before compelling service providers to disclose contents and records. But this law does not restrict providers from voluntarily selling that information to non-governmental third parties. Due to this loophole in the law, American government is effectively resurrected the idea of general warrants that the Founding Fathers were so appalled by. Thankfully, the House of Representatives voted to close that loophole. The House voted overwhelmingly this week for the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act. I'm so glad that the Fourth Amendment for Sale Act is popular, that Senator Schumer has been a co-sponsor of this. I hope he will vote with us tonight. But if he chooses not to vote with us tonight, the bill is passed the House. All he would need to do is bring it up in the next few weeks, and we could actually put it on the books. Leaders of both parties from across the political spectrum have come together to say you shouldn't be able to buy your way around the Fourth Amendment. The Senate must not prove itself to be less concerned about the Fourth Amendment. I hope that we will take this up. The data you transmit can reveal much about your life, such as where you work, where you drop off your child for daycare, whether you visit a gun range, who you associate with, your health data. Some of these applications sell that data to third-party brokers who then sell it to the government. It may be concerning that some of your information is traded away, but we should insist that the Fourth Amendment should be respected so that individuals are not tracked and investigated without a warrant. When law enforcement suspects you of a crime, the supreme law of the land is clear. Officers must demonstrate to a neutral judge in an open court that probable cause of a crime exists. In fact, if you want to find the people in our country who respect the Fourth Amendment, meet with any local police officer or any local sheriff. They know they don't come in your house. What's happened is the politicized aspects of our intel agencies don't have the same respect for the Fourth Amendment that local law enforcement does. According to Professor Matthew Tokson, a professor at the University of Utah, after the Supreme Court prohibited warrantless collection of cell phone location data in Carpenter versus the United States, the government agencies just began buying that information anyway. They were told not to by the Supreme Court, so they just went and purchased it and eviscerated a Supreme Court decision. This is something we should not tolerate. A recent report by the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security demonstrated that several DHS agencies, including the Secret Service, bought Americans' phone location data without a court order. The IRS purchases location data without a court order. The FBI purchases your location data without an order. To just name a few, the the NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, all have bought Americans' location data without a court order. The embrace of this tactic proves that the feds will zealously exploit any loophole and test the limits of their authorities to the detriment of our constitutionally protected liberties. It's time to end the use of cash to purchase general warrants that the Fourth Amendment should have abolished over 2 centuries ago. Let's ensure that the Fourth Amendment is truly not for sale. I ask for a yes vote.
Mr. President.
Senator for Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the amendment. And before I get to the substance, I want to make a comment that I'm going to be making.
Senator, desist for a moment. Senator from Kentucky.
I call up my amendment number 1829 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment numbered 1829.
There will now be 2 minutes to debate, equally divided, on the Paul Amendment 1829.
Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the amendment. And before I get to the substance, let me remind my colleagues, I think something we've all discussed a lot. Any amendment added to this bill at this moment is the equivalent of killing the bill. Many have said, if we go past midnight tonight, it doesn't really matter. Already, telecom companies, a number, have contacted the Department of Justice saying, if this bill expires, as it will at midnight, they will stop complying with 702, one of the most critical components of our intelligence backbone. The specifics of this amendment are opposed by every law enforcement agency in America. It is also opposed by a number of Jewish community groups, including B'nai B'rith and anti-defamation leagues. And I would agree with the senator from Kentucky, we ought to have a debate about data brokers. But 702 is not the place to have it. Matter of fact, the House decided not to include this in their discussion of 702. If we pass this amendment, the only people that will be taken out from purchasing data will be law enforcement, not foreign companies, not foreign governments, or others.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
The idea that we don't have time is a specious one. The only reason we wouldn't have time is because the supporters of this bill delayed to the last hour. We have 5 years to renew this. We delayed it till we have 4 hours left, and then we're told we can't amend it because we don't have enough time. That is a false argument. The House is still here. They're going to be voting tomorrow. We should pass the good amendments today, send them to the House tomorrow. This is an argument that has been forced upon us by the supporters of FISA who want no debate, and they want no restrictions, they want no warrants, and they want nothing to protect the Americans. They want to allow whatever goes, whatever happens, happens, and to hell with the American individual citizen and the Bill of Rights. I say, don't listen to the people who don't want amendments and don't want debate, and let's pass this amendment.
Questions on the amendment? Yeas and nays have been requested. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Braun, Kramer, Daines, Durbin, Hawley, Lummis, Markey, Marshall, Murphy, Murray, Paul, Sanders, Tester, Welch, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Blumenthal, Britt, Budd, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Crapo, Ernst, Fetterman, Fisher, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Lankford, Lujan, Mullen, Peters, Reed, Ricketts, Risch, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Sinema, Smith, Thune, Warner, Wicker, Young. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Butler, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Tillis, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Brown, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, no. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Coons, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 31, the nays are 61. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
now before we move on